These weren't theoretical calculations. These were professional military assessments based on logistics tables and operational experience. German staff officers understood that they were watching the mathematical certainty of their army's destruction. Let me provide more detailed analysis of the specific calculations that German staff officers performed. The Sixth Army's logistical requirements were calculated with precision. German quartermaster tables, refined through years of operational experience on the Eastern Front, specified exact requirements for different force compositions. A force of 284,000 soldiers required approximately 500 to 700 tons of supplies daily. This wasn't arbitrary. This number came from operational experience. It accounted for food rations for 284,000 men. It accounted for ammunition consumption in active combat. It accounted for fuel for vehicles and generators. It accounted for replacement parts, medical supplies, clothing, and all the other materials necessary to maintain an army in combat during a Russian winter. The breakdown was approximately as follows. Food rations alone required 250 to 300 tons per day. Ammunition for active combat operations required 100 to 150 tons per day. Fuel for vehicles, generators, and heating required 50 to 100 tons per day. Medical supplies, clothing, spare parts, and miscellaneous items required another 100 to 150 tons daily. These were the actual documented requirements from German quartermaster records. This wasn't speculation. This was based on what the Sixth Army actually consumed during active operations before encirclement. Now consider what actually arrived by air. The Luftwaffe had approximately 300 transport aircraft. The primary transport aircraft was the Junkers U-52, a tri-motor transport that could carry approximately 2 tons of cargo per mission. In ideal conditions, with no losses, with perfect weather, with no enemy interference, those 300 aircraft could theoretically make multiple trips per day. Theoretically, perhaps 250 tons per day might have been achievable, but those were ideal conditions that never existed. Soviet fighter aircraft patrolled the skies above the pocket. Soviet Yak-1 fighters and other Soviet aircraft shot down German transport aircraft regularly. In December 1942 alone, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 100 transport aircraft. That's a loss rate of 33% per month. By January, transport aircraft losses had become catastrophic. Weather was another factor. December 1942 saw heavy snowfall. January and February saw consistent fog and cloud cover. Days when flying was impossible due to weather were frequent. Perhaps 50% of potential flying days had weather that prevented operations. Soviet anti-aircraft fire was another factor. Even aircraft that weren't shot down were damaged. Damaged aircraft required repair. Some aircraft were so damaged they couldn't be repaired. Every aircraft lost reduced the pool of available transports. Realistically, German logistics officers calculated that the Luftwaffe could deliver approximately 100 to 200 tons per day under actual conditions. Some days with good weather and few losses might approach 200 tons. Many days with poor weather or heavy losses might result in only 50 to 100 tons delivered. The actual average delivery was approximately 80 to 100 tons per day. Some sources suggest it was even lower, averaging perhaps 70 tons per day over the entire siege. With only 80 to 100 tons per day arriving when 500 to 700 tons were required, the Sixth Army was receiving only 12 to 20% of its minimum requirements. German staff officers understood this immediately. They performed the arithmetic and the answer was unambiguous. The Sixth Army would slowly be deprived of everything necessary to fight and survive. With only 80 tons of supplies arriving and needing 500 to 700 tons, approximately 420 to 620 tons of required supplies were missing every single day. That daily deficit meant that the Sixth Army was living off reserves. Stores of supplies accumulated before encirclement were being consumed faster than they could be replaced. Those stores lasted for approximately 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, supplies were exhausted. the Sixth Army had to cut rations. Initially, German soldiers were on approximately 1,200 calories per day ration. By late November, this was cut to 1,000 calories. By December, rations were cut to 800 calories. By January, rations had been cut to the starvation level of 300 calories per day. For context, a healthy adult requires approximately 2,000 calories per day in normal conditions. A soldier in cold weather performing physical activity requires approximately 4,500 calories per day. 300 calories per day is less than 15% of what a soldier in a Russian winter actually needs. Soldiers cannot survive long on 300 calories per day. Horses were a source of meat. The Sixth Army had approximately 4,000 horses. These horses were used for supply transport and ammunition movement since fuel was limited. As supplies became critical, soldiers began slaughtering horses for meat. Horses provided meat, but only temporarily. Once the horses were exhausted, soldiers had to find other sources. Supplies became desperate. Food depots were consumed. Anything edible was eaten. Some accounts describe soldiers eating leather from boots, searching for any source of calories. Ammunition was also rationed due to the limited supplies. Artillery couldn't be used at normal rates of fire. Ammunition for infantry weapons was restricted. Soldiers were told to conserve ammunition. Fire discipline became critical because ammunition wasn't being replaced. This had tactical implications. The Sixth Army couldn't respond to Soviet attacks with the intensity that would normally be possible. Soviet forces would attack, and German forces couldn't respond with adequate firepower because ammunition was rationed. German defenders would have to absorb Soviet attacks and respond minimally to conserve ammunition. Fuel shortages meant vehicles couldn't move. By January, the Sixth Army had barely any fuel for vehicles. Movement had to be by foot. Wounded had to be carried manually or lay in shelters. Supply distribution had to be manual labor instead of vehicle transport. Medical facilities were affected. Field hospitals normally run generators to provide lighting and power for surgical equipment and heating. With fuel unavailable, generators couldn't run. Field hospitals operated in darkness. Surgery had to be performed in cold, without adequate lighting, without adequate equipment. Heating fuel was unavailable. Soldiers in shelter tried to maintain fires using whatever they could find. Wooden structures were torn apart and burned. Rubble was burned. But there simply wasn't enough fuel. By January, the pocket was in the depths of Russian winter. Temperatures dropped to -20 and -30 degrees Celsius. Without adequate fuel, soldiers were literally freezing. Frostbite became endemic. Soldiers' feet froze. Soldiers' hands froze. Gangrene developed as tissue died. Amputation became common. But medical personnel could only amputate so many limbs. Field hospitals were overwhelmed. Disease spread rapidly. The combination of inadequate nutrition, severe cold, poor hygiene, and overcrowding created conditions for disease. Typhus was spread by lice. Dysentery spread through poor sanitation. Pneumonia and influenza spread through close quarters. Soldiers without adequate nutrition couldn't fight disease. Death rates accelerated. By mid-January, soldiers were dying at rates of several thousand per day. Some days more soldiers died from disease, starvation, and cold than from combat. One of the most devastating aspects was that German commanders understood all of this in advance. Officers like Major Wilhelm Adam, Paulus's adjutant, later described the atmosphere at Sixth Army headquarters as one of surreal calm mixed with quiet desperation. The commanders understood what was happening. They understood the mathematics. They understood that nothing could change the outcome. But they were trapped by Hitler's orders. They couldn't order a breakout. They couldn't save their own lives or their soldiers' lives. General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, one of Paulus's corps commanders, advocated loudly for a breakout attempt. Seydlitz argued that the only possible way to save the army was to break through Soviet lines and link up with relief forces. Seydlitz even drafted breakout orders. But Paulus, loyal to Hitler, refused to issue those orders. Seydlitz, for his insubordination in advocating for breakout, was threatened with court-martial by Paulus himself. Field. Marshal Erich von Manstein took command of the relief operation with the goal of reaching the trapped Sixth Army. Manstein was one of Germany's most capable commanders. Manstein understood the situation. He understood that relief would be extraordinarily difficult. Manstein assembled forces for Operation Wintergewitter. These forces included German 4th Panzer Army and other units. Manstein's plan was to attack northward from the south, break through Soviet defensive lines, and link up with the 6th Army. The operation began in late November. German forces attacked northward. Soviet forces resisted fiercely. Fighting was intense. German forces advanced slowly, fighting against Soviet opposition at every point. By early December, German relief forces had advanced to within 48 kilometers of the pocket. This was the closest relief forces would get. For a brief moment, if the Sixth Army had broken out toward the relief forces and if they had met somewhere in between, the encirclement might have been broken. Manstein ordered the Sixth Army to attempt breakout. Paulus was directed to attack southward to meet relief forces. This was the opportunity. This was the moment when breakout might have been possible. November 19, 1942, 07:30 Moscow time. The morning sky above the Volga erupted into flame. Over 3,500 Soviet guns opened fire simultaneously across a front stretching 250 kilometers. The bombardment was so massive that the ground shook for kilometers behind German lines. In bunkers and trenches, German soldiers felt the concussion waves from explosions kilometers away. This wasn't a typical artillery barrage. This was the opening of Operation Uranus, the largest encirclement operation in military history. Opposing the Soviet offensive were the German Sixth Army under General Paulus, the Italian Eighth Army, the Hungarian Second Army, and the Romanian Fourth Army. The German Sixth Army consisted of approximately 284,000 German soldiers plus support units. The entire force in the Stalingrad area numbered over 330,000 men. But the Germans weren't aware yet of what was actually happening. They thought they were facing a local counterattack, a probing attack, something to be dealt with like previous Soviet offensives had been dealt with. They didn't understand they were about to be trapped. They didn't understand that in the next few hours, over 1 million Soviet soldiers with 900 tanks and 13,500 artillery pieces would overwhelm the thin German defensive lines on the northern and southern flanks and begin an encirclement operation that would doom the Sixth Army. Let me tell you about the moment when German commanders realized what was actually happening. The moment when they understood that mathematics, not tactics or courage or will, had decided the fate of their army. When the Soviet bombardment started at 07:30, General Paulus was at Sixth Army headquarters. He was informed that Soviet forces were attacking the Romanian positions to the north. Paulus issued orders to shift reserves northward. He thought this was a local crisis that could be managed. By mid-morning, reports indicated that the Romanian Fourth Army was collapsing. Not being defeated. Collapsing. The Romanian soldiers, inadequately equipped and inadequately trained, were breaking under the Soviet assault. Soviet tanks were pouring through gaps in the line. Soviet mechanized columns were advancing at speed. Paulus realized this was more serious than a local attack. He contacted Field Marshal Alexander Wykes, who commanded Army Group B. Wykes informed Paulus that the situation on the Romanian front was catastrophic. Soviet forces had broken through in multiple places. At this point, informed commanders understood what this meant. A breakthrough in your flank means encirclement. If Soviet forces were advancing rapidly from the north, and if, as intelligence indicated, Soviet forces were also advancing from the south, those two Soviet forces meeting would create a pocket. The Sixth Army would be trapped. Paulus recommended immediate withdrawal. Withdrawal from Stalingrad, withdrawal from the city, withdrawal to the west to avoid encirclement. This withdrawal would have been risky, but it would have allowed the Sixth Army to escape the trap that was forming. Paulus forwarded this recommendation up the chain of command to Field Marshal Keitel at German High Command. Keitel took the recommendation to Hitler. Hitler's response was immediate and absolute. No withdrawal. The Sixth Army would remain in Stalingrad. The Sixth Army would hold the city. Hitler's authority was final. There would be no retreat. This decision, made at 16 on November 19th, was the decision that doomed the Sixth Army. But the full implication of that decision wouldn't become clear until mathematicians and logistics officers performed calculations that showed the arithmetic of destruction over the next 3 days, November 20th through November 23rd. Soviet forces continued their encirclement. The northern Soviet prong advanced from the north. The southern Soviet prong advanced from the south. German forces attempted to contain the breakthrough, but they lacked sufficient reserves. German forces simply didn't have enough soldiers to defend against attacks from multiple directions across such a vast front. On November 23rd, Soviet forces completed the encirclement. Soviet tanks from the north and south linked up at Kalach, closing the ring. The Sixth Army was surrounded. Approximately 284,000 German soldiers were trapped in a pocket approximately 50 kilometers across. The moment of encirclement created a situation unlike anything the German army had previously experienced. This wasn't a temporary crisis that could be resolved through tactical maneuvering. This was strategic catastrophe. The entire Sixth Army was trapped. The only way to survive was either to break out or to be relieved. Hitler authorized a relief operation, Operation Wintergewitter or Operation Winter Storm. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein was assigned to command relief forces. Von Manstein understood the situation. He understood that Soviet forces surrounding the pocket were numerically superior. He understood that relief forces would have to fight their way through massive Soviet defenses. He understood that this would be extraordinarily difficult. But before the relief operation even began, German staff officers began performing calculations. They began calculating what it would take to sustain 284,000 soldiers trapped in a pocket. These calculations were straightforward but devastating. A trapped army requires supply, food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, everything needed to sustain soldiers in combat during a Russian winter. German quartermaster tables, developed from years of operational experience, specified that a force the size of the Sixth Army required a minimum of 500 to 700 tons of supplies per day. This wasn't a maximum. This was a minimum, 500 to 700 tons per day, just to keep soldiers alive and capable of fighting. The question was, how would these supplies reach the trapped army? The only way was by air. Soviet forces completely surrounded the pocket. Ground resupply was impossible. The only way to supply the Sixth Army was through the air. The Luftwaffe had approximately 300 transport aircraft, primarily U-52 tri-motor transports. These aircraft, in ideal conditions, could carry approximately 250 tons per day total. But ideal conditions didn't exist. Soviet interceptors attacked German transport aircraft. German aircraft were shot down regularly. Soviet anti-aircraft fire damaged aircraft. Weather prevented flying. Fog, snow, and cloud cover grounded aircraft. In real conditions, realistic capacity was perhaps 100 to 200 tons per day at best. Luftwaffe. Commander Hermann Göring was asked if the Luftwaffe could supply the pocket. Göring, perhaps understanding that his answer would determine whether the Sixth Army was abandoned or whether Hitler would authorize relief operations, claimed that yes, the Luftwaffe could supply 500 tons per day. Göring knew this was false, but he gave Hitler the answer Hitler wanted to hear. Hitler, hearing that the Luftwaffe could supply the pocket, authorized the Sixth Army to remain in place. The relief operation would fight its way to the pocket. The Sixth Army would be relieved. Everything would be fine. This was the moment when German commanders understood the mathematical reality. Officers with responsibilities for supply and logistics began calculating what would actually happen with air supply of 100 to 200 tons per day when 500 to 700 tons were required. The answer was unambiguous. With only 30 to 40% of required supply, the Sixth Army would slowly starve. Rations would be cut progressively. Soldiers would receive fewer calories. By December, soldiers would be on starvation rations. By January, soldiers would be dying from hunger and cold. With only partial ammunition supply, the Sixth Army wouldn't be able to sustain heavy combat. Artillery ammunition would be rationed. Soldiers would run out of ammunition. The pocket would become progressively weaker. With inadequate fuel supply, soldiers would freeze. Medical facilities would lack fuel for heating. Vehicles would lack fuel for transport. The pocket would gradually lose capability. Paulus refused. Paulus followed Hitler's orders. Paulus remained in place. The breakout attempt never occurred. The window of opportunity closed. German relief forces couldn't break through the Soviet defenses alone. Soviet forces had learned from the German encirclement of the Sixth Army. Soviet forces prepared defensive lines specifically to prevent German relief forces from reaching the pocket. German forces couldn't overcome these defenses. After weeks of fighting, Manstein had to acknowledge that relief was impossible. German forces couldn't break through. The relief operation had failed. By January 1943, the situation had become completely desperate. Soviet forces had advanced into the pocket. The pocket had been reduced to only a few kilometers in some areas. German forces were compressed into smaller and smaller areas. Soldiers were starving. Soldiers were freezing. Soldiers were dying from wounds and disease because medical care was unavailable. Combat capability had deteriorated to almost nothing. German soldiers could barely hold weapons because their hands were too cold and weak. Soviet forces attacked relentlessly. German forces tried to defend, but the defense was becoming increasingly desperate. Soldiers were running out of ammunition. Soldiers lacked the strength to fight effectively. Some units simply collapsed. By late January, the situation had become unbearable. Soviet forces offered terms of surrender. German forces were desperate and running out of options. General Paulus authorized negotiation of surrender terms. On February 2, 1943, the Sixth Army officially surrendered. The remaining surviving soldiers, approximately 90,000 men, were taken prisoner by Soviet forces. The total casualties exceeded expectations. Approximately 200,000 German soldiers had been killed or died from wounds, starvation, or disease. Another 90,000 had been captured. Of those captured, many would die in Soviet captivity in the post-war months. Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian soldiers who had been trapped with the Sixth Army were also casualties. Combined casualties at Stalingrad exceeded 850,000 soldiers. All of this death and suffering flowed from the mathematics that German staff officers calculated on November 19, 1942. The mathematics showed that the Sixth Army couldn't be sustained. The Sixth Army would be destroyed. Hitler refused to authorize withdrawal, and 284,000 soldiers paid the price. After the war, General Paulus survived Soviet captivity and lived until 1957. He spent the post-war years attempting to explain his decisions. He testified at the Nuremberg trials. He gave interviews to historians. Paulus clearly understood that he could have ordered a breakout. He understood that such an order might have saved a portion of his army. But he chose to follow Hitler's orders instead. This was his tragedy. And it was the tragedy of the Sixth Army, not a military tragedy, not a tactical failure, but a tragedy of logistics and command decisions and the realization that mathematics, not heroism, determines military outcomes. The destruction of the Sixth Army was mathematically certain on November 19, 1942. Human will made that certainty take longer to manifest. German soldiers' determination meant that the final destruction took 75 days instead of happening immediately. But the mathematical certainty was never in doubt. November 19, 1942 was the day German commanders knew Stalingrad was lost. Not from the intensity of Soviet artillery, not from the speed of Soviet advances, but from the mathematics of logistics. They calculated how much supply was needed. They calculated how much supply could be delivered. They subtracted one from the other. And the answer was clear. The Sixth Army would be destroyed. That mathematical certainty, calculated on November 19, 1942, manifested as reality over the next 75 days. German soldiers died slowly from hunger, cold, disease, and combat. Soviet soldiers died trying to destroy them. The entire catastrophe flowed from mathematics and a command decision to refuse withdrawal. This is the story of Operation Uranus, not a story of military heroism, but a story of logistics and mathematics and the realization that these factors determine military outcomes more fundamentally than anything else. The Sixth Army fought bravely. German soldiers did everything they could, but they were doomed from the moment Hitler refused to authorize withdrawal. They were doomed by mathematics. And mathematics, in warfare as in everything else, cannot be overcome by will or courage or any other human quality. That is the ultimate lesson of Stalingrad. That is why the destruction of the Sixth Army matters historically. That is why November 19, 1942 was the day when German commanders knew their army was lost. The mathematics had decided. History simply had to unfold. Let me talk about what this means historically and strategically, what the destruction of the Sixth Army represents for military history and military strategy more broadly. The destruction of the Sixth Army marked a turning point in World War II. Before Stalingrad, the German army appeared potentially capable of achieving victory. Germany held vast territories. German forces were experienced and dangerous. German military capability appeared formidable. After Stalingrad, it became clear that Germany couldn't win. Germany had lost an entire army. Germany couldn't replace the equipment. Germany couldn't replace the soldiers. Germany couldn't replace the leadership. Worse, for German soldiers on the Eastern Front and elsewhere, the destruction of the Sixth Army meant that Germany was incapable of protecting its soldiers. Germany would ask soldiers to fight and die, but Germany couldn't promise to save them or relieve them or support them. Germany could only promise that soldiers would fight and die in lost causes. This realization spread through the German army. After Stalingrad, morale never recovered. German soldiers still fought. German soldiers still died, but they fought knowing that victory was impossible and that Germany would sacrifice them with no possibility of success. For Hitler and German leadership, the destruction of the Sixth Army meant that Germany had to fundamentally reconsider its strategy. Germany couldn't conduct the offensive operations it had planned. Germany was forced into a defensive posture. Germany could only attempt to hold territory rather than conquer it. From this point forward, the war became one of attrition. Germany couldn't outproduce the Allies. Germany couldn't replace losses. Germany was steadily being ground down by opponents. With greater resources and greater capacity, let me talk about the personalities and command decisions that shaped this tragedy. General Paulus was 51 years old when he took command of the Sixth Army in 1942. Paulus had risen through the German military ranks. Paulus was intelligent and capable. Paulus was known as a staff officer, someone who excelled at planning and organization. Paulus was not known as a field commander who made independent decisions. This distinction mattered. Staff officers typically excel at implementing orders from higher command. Field commanders typically excel at making independent decisions based on changing conditions. Paulus was a staff officer elevated to field command. This meant Paulus was more inclined to follow orders from higher authority rather than make independent decisions that might contradict those orders. When Field Marshal Keitel at German High Command conveyed Hitler's order that the Sixth Army hold Stalingrad, Paulus accepted that order. When Hitler refused withdrawal recommendations, Paulus accepted that refusal. When Hitler ordered relief operations to relieve the Sixth Army in place, Paulus accepted that order. Paulus's chief of staff was General Arthur Schmidt. Schmidt was known for his loyalty to Nazi ideals and to Hitler personally. Schmidt opposed breakout discussions. Schmidt reinforced orders from higher command rather than questioning them. This combination of Paulus and Schmidt meant that the Sixth Army would follow Hitler's orders regardless of tactical situation. This wasn't because Paulus and Schmidt were incompetent. It was because they were following the command structure and orders from higher authority. General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, commanding 51st Army Corps within the 6th Army, represented an alternative perspective. Seydlitz was more independent-minded. Seydlitz believed that the 6th Army should break out to avoid encirclement. When Seydlitz advocated for breakout, he was opposing Paulus's loyalty to Hitler's orders. Seydlitz actually drafted breakout orders. Seydlitz prepared to execute a breakout operation, but Paulus reported Seydlitz to Hitler for insubordination. Hitler threatened court-martial proceedings against Seydlitz. Seydlitz was forced to abandon his initiative. The loyalty to chain of command to Hitler's orders overrode the tactical logic of breakout. This reveals a fundamental problem in German military culture at this time. German officers were trained to follow orders from superior authority. This was appropriate for most circumstances. But when orders came from Hitler, who was both political leader and military commander and whose orders were often strategically unsound, this created a crisis. Officers like Seydlitz who questioned orders were seen as disloyal. Officers like Paulus who followed orders were seen as loyal. But loyalty to orders that guaranteed the destruction of 284,000 soldiers was a catastrophic form of loyalty. Let me talk about the Soviet side of this. Operation Uranus was commanded by Soviet generals, Alexander Vasilevsky and Georgy Zhukov. Vasilevsky and Zhukov were among the finest Soviet military commanders. They planned Operation Uranus with care and coordination. The operation required coordinating over 1 million soldiers. It required precise timing of the northern and southern pincers. It required sustained operations across vast distances in winter conditions. Soviet soldiers fought with determination and skill. Soviet forces overcame German resistance. Soviet forces executed the encirclement despite facing a capable and well-armed enemy. The cost to Soviet forces was enormous. Soviet casualties exceeded 400,000 at Stalingrad. Soviet losses were nearly as large as German losses. But Soviet losses were replaceable because the Soviet Union had the resources to replace them. Germany didn't. This reveals another aspect of the mathematics. The Soviet Union could replace 400,000 casualties. Germany couldn't. Over time, this meant that the Soviet Union would prevail, even if both sides suffered similar casualty rates. Stalingrad demonstrated this principle. Both sides suffered enormous casualties. But the Soviet Union recovered from those casualties. Germany never did. Let me talk about the relief operation in more detail. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein was one of Germany's finest military commanders. Manstein understood encirclement operations and defensive strategy better than perhaps any German officer. Manstein was assigned to command the relief operation, Operation Wintergewitter. Manstein faced an almost impossible task. He had to gather available reserves, organize a relief column, and fight through Soviet defenses to reach the 6th Army pocket. The Soviet defenses were formidable. The Soviets had anticipated German relief attempts and prepared for them. The relief operation began in late November with German forces attacking northward from the south. Manstein personally coordinated the operation. Manstein attacked Soviet positions, destroyed Soviet units, and advanced northward. By December, relief forces had advanced approximately 48 kilometers toward the pocket. This was the closest they would get. The German relief forces had advanced as far as the Mishkova River. The 6th Army was still approximately 48 kilometers north of this position. At this critical moment, Manstein ordered the 6th Army to break out and link up with relief forces. Manstein understood that this was the only possible opportunity. If the 6th Army broke out and if relief forces could hold their position, the two forces might link up and break the encirclement. Paulus, however, refused to order breakout. Paulus followed Hitler's orders to remain in place and await relief. The window of opportunity closed. Relief forces couldn't advance farther. Soviet defenses stopped the relief operation. Manstein had done everything possible. Manstein had fought his way to within 48 kilometers of the pocket. But without the 6th Army breaking out to meet him, Manstein couldn't complete the relief. After approximately 3 weeks of fighting, Manstein had to accept that relief was impossible. German forces were being pushed back. Soviet forces were too strong. The relief operation had failed. Let me talk about what happened in January and February as the pocket collapsed. By January 1943, the Sixth Army faced terminal decline. Soviet forces had compressed the pocket further. The area available to German forces had shrunk to a few kilometers in some sectors. German soldiers were packed into desperate defensive positions. Rations had been cut again and again. Soldiers were eating approximately 300 calories per day. Soldiers were starving. Starvation and cold became the primary killers. More soldiers died from starvation and disease than from combat. Frostbite was widespread. Soldiers' extremities froze in the intense cold. Gangrene developed. Amputations became routine. But medical personnel lacked anesthetics and antibiotics. Soldiers endured amputations in agony. Typhus spread through the pocket. Lice, the vector for typhus, infested the soldiers. Soldiers lacked the ability to bathe or change clothes. Typhus infected thousands. Many died from typhus. Soviet forces, despite having taken enormous casualties, continued attacking. Soviet forces wanted to finish the Sixth Army quickly. Soviet forces knew that the Sixth Army was doomed and wanted to complete the destruction. German soldiers defended with the courage of the desperate. But courage couldn't overcome starvation, cold, disease, and ammunition shortages. German soldiers were simply being worn down by the accumulation of hardship. By February 1st, the situation had become completely hopeless. German defensive lines had collapsed in most sectors. Soviet forces were overrunning German positions. Order had broken down. Individual German soldiers were surrendering when they could. On February 2, 1943, General Paulus authorized the surrender of the Sixth Army. Approximately 90,000 surviving German soldiers became prisoners of war. Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian prisoners added to this number. The casualty figures were staggering. Approximately 200,000 German soldiers died or were killed in the pocket. Over 90,000 were captured. Of those captured, many would die in Soviet captivity over the following months. Soviet casualties exceeded 400,000. Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian forces suffered approximately 100,000 casualties. Total combined casualties at Stalingrad exceeded 850,000 soldiers. For context, 850,000 casualties represents approximately the population of a major city. One city's worth of human beings died or were wounded in the fighting at Stalingrad. Let me talk about what happened to survivors after the war. The surviving German prisoners from the Sixth Army faced Soviet captivity. Soviet captivity in 1943 was harsh. Prisoners lacked adequate food. Prisoners worked in Soviet labor camps. Many prisoners died from disease, malnutrition, and exposure. Approximately 50,000 German prisoners from the Sixth Army survived captivity and were eventually released or repatriated to Germany. Approximately 40,000 to 50,000 died in captivity. Many of the surviving soldiers spent years in captivity. Some weren't released until 1948 or later. These soldiers had lost everything. Home destroyed, families uncertain of their survival. Years of their lives lost to captivity. The survivors carried psychological scars. Survivors had to live with the knowledge that they had been abandoned by Hitler, that their army had been sacrificed to Hitler's pride, that sacrifice had been meaningless in terms of military outcome. Let me talk about memorialization and historical significance. Stalingrad became Volgograd in 1961 after Nikita Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign. But the battlefield area remained significant. The Soviet Union constructed a massive memorial complex at Stalingrad. The Mamayev-Kurgan Memorial overlooks the battlefield. A massive statue of a Soviet soldier stands on the hill. Walls with inscriptions commemorate the soldiers who died. For Russia, Stalingrad represented the pivotal moment when the Soviet Union proved it could defeat German forces. Stalingrad was the beginning of the Soviet Union's ultimate victory over Nazi Germany. Stalingrad transformed Russian military morale and confidence. For Germany, Stalingrad represented the moment when German victory became impossible. Stalingrad was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Stalingrad meant that Germany would gradually be ground down and eventually defeated. Military academies worldwide teach Stalingrad as the classic example of how logistics and mathematics determine military outcomes. Stalingrad is studied as a lesson in the dangers of encirclement and the importance of maintaining supply. Let me talk about lessons militaries learned from Stalingrad for future operations. First, supply lines must be protected. A surrounded force with cut supply lines cannot be sustained. Protecting supply line security is as important as protecting combat units. Second, encirclement is an extremely dangerous situation. All military planners since Stalingrad understand the danger of encirclement. Military forces avoid situations where they can be encircled. If encirclement occurs, breakout becomes the immediate priority. Third, airborne supply has severe limitations. The experience at Stalingrad with air supply showed that aircraft cannot reliably sustain a surrounded force. Modern militaries understand that air supply can contribute but cannot be the sole source of supply. Fourth, command structure matters. The ability of commanders to make independent decisions can determine survival. Paulus's inability to make independent decisions meant the Sixth Army couldn't adapt to changing circumstances. Fifth, the mathematics of logistics is sovereign. No amount of courage or will or tactical skill can overcome a logistics catastrophe. Modern military planning emphasizes logistics planning before committing forces to combat. All of these lessons trace back to Stalingrad. Stalingrad was the proving ground where these lessons were written in blood and suffering. In conclusion, November 19, 1942 was not just another day in World War II. November 19, 1942 was the day when mathematics decided the fate of 284,000 German soldiers. German staff officers performed calculations on that day. They subtracted air supply capacity from supply requirements. The answer was clear. The Sixth Army would be destroyed. 75 days later, on February 2, 1943, that mathematical certainty had been fully manifested. The Sixth Army had been destroyed. Over 200,000 German soldiers had died. Over 90,000 had been captured. All of this death and destruction flowed from mathematics and from Hitler's refusal to authorize the decisions that might have saved the army. This is why Stalingrad endures in military history and memory. Not because of the most dramatic battles or the most heroic actions, but because Stalingrad demonstrates that mathematics, logistics, and industrial capacity determine military outcomes more fundamentally than anything else. The Sixth Army fought bravely. German soldiers endured unimaginable suffering. German commanders attempted to manage an impossible situation. But mathematics was sovereign. Logistics was decisive. And 284,000 soldiers paid the price for mathematics and command decisions that guaranteed their destruction. That is the ultimate lesson of November 19, 1942 at Stalingrad.